Emily Hartwell was the daughter who uncovered secrets she was never meant to see. Michael Hartwell was the son who chose loyalty over truth. And Mr. Hartwell, the father everyone admired, was the man whose lies would tear his family apart. Their story isn't about strangers or outsiders. It's about betrayal within a home, and the shocking truth that Detective Marcus Lane would stop at nothing to reveal. The Hartwell family seemed to live a charmed life. Their home sat on a quiet suburban street where neighbors waved, lawns were trimmed, and the afternoon sun always seemed to hit their windows just right. Mr. Hartwell was respected in the community, a man of business who carried himself with confidence. Mrs. Hartwell was admired for her poise, the kind of mother who baked for school events and kept everything looking perfect. Their children appeared to embody the same ideal: Michael, the dependable eldest son; Emily, the inquisitive teenage daughter; and Sarah, the youngest, innocent and carefree. From the outside, they looked like a family many envied, but perfect. Families have cracks, and in the Hartwells' case, those cracks were about to split wide open. Emily was the first to notice. Unlike her brother, she wasn't content to accept everything at face value. She had always been curious, the type to scribble her thoughts into a worn notebook she kept hidden under her mattress. At first her entries were harmless observations, schoolwork, friends, dreams for the future. But over time, her writing grew darker. She recorded late-night arguments between her parents, whispered phone calls her father took in the driveway, and the strange tension that seemed to thicken the air inside the house. She didn't just write about what she saw. She wrote about how it made her feel, how the warmth of her family was slowly being replaced by a chill she couldn't shake. Then the inconsistencies started to stand out. Financial papers tucked away in drawers didn't match the lifestyle her father flaunted. Money seemed to come and go without explanation. Emily noticed how her father's smile in public never reached his eyes, and how her mother seemed to flinch at questions about where he had been. She began to connect dots, ones that led her to a frightening possibility. The life they lived was built on lies. For a girl who had once admired her father, the discovery was devastating. And for someone as headstrong as Emily, silence was never an option. She tried to speak to her family about what she found. To her mother, she hinted at the hidden papers, but Mrs. Hartwell brushed it off, urging her to focus on school instead of grown-up worries. To her brother Michael, she confided her suspicions, hoping he would understand. But Michael, ever loyal to their father, dismissed her fears. His words may have been calm, but the fear in his eyes told another story. Emily realized she was alone in her quest for the truth, and that isolation only pushed her further. Her journal entries grew frantic in the days before she vanished. "They don't want me to know," she wrote, "but I already do." Another line, scribbled quickly: "If anything happens to me, it won't be an accident." For those who read those words later, they were chilling. At the time, they were just the thoughts of a teenager who had seen too much. And then, one evening, Emily was gone. No one saw her leave. No one heard the door open. Her room looked untouched. Her backpack sat by the desk, and her phone was left behind. Neighbors later reported that the Hartwells didn't call for help immediately. They waited. Hours passed before the police were contacted, and even then, the story felt rehearsed, like lines spoken from a script. Mr. Hartwell insisted Emily had run away. Mrs. Hartwell echoed him, though her voice trembled. Michael said little at all. This is where Detective Marcus Lane entered the story. A man seasoned by years of solving cases that others deemed unsolvable. Lane had learned to look past appearances. When he walked into the Hartwell home, he didn't see the pristine family portrait hanging on the wall. He saw the tension in their eyes, the silence that carried too much weight. He noticed the way Mr. Hartwell spoke for everyone, the way Michael avoided eye contact, the way Mrs. Hartwell seemed to shrink into the background. It was the kind of atmosphere Lane had come to recognize, A family hiding something, Lane began, piecing together the puzzle, starting with Emily's journal. He read every line, every frantic scrawl, and felt the urgency in her words. This wasn't a girl planning to leave. This was a girl afraid of being silenced. That alone told him Emily hadn't simply walked away. Something far darker was at play. Viewers, think about this. What do you make of Emily's words? If you stumbled on a journal like that, would you see it as paranoia or as a warning? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're here, make sure to like this video and subscribe, because what Detective Lane discovered next was unlike anything he had ever seen before. Emily Hartwell's disappearance was just the beginning. Behind it lay a story of lies, loyalty twisted into control, and betrayals so deep they would leave scars on everyone involved. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered, and Lane was about to pull back the curtain on a family secret no one could have imagined. Detective Marcus Lane knew from the start that the Hartwell case wasn't going to be simple. On the surface, it looked like a missing person report. A teenage girl vanishes, leaving behind a home, a family, and a community wondering where she could have gone. But every instinct told him this wasn't a runaway story. Emily Hartwell's absence wasn't voluntary. She had been silenced, and the people closest to her held the answers, whether they admitted it or not. The investigation began with neighbors. Some described the Hartwells as polite, even admirable, while others admitted that lately something seemed off in the household. A few mentioned overhearing raised voices late at night, arguments muffled through the suburban calm. No one saw Emily leave, and no one noticed unusual activity around the house. But one neighbor recalled seeing the lights on at nearly 3 in the morning, shadows moving behind curtains, though the family denied anyone was awake at that hour. It was a small detail, but Lane tucked it away. Cases like this were built on small details. Emily's journal became his anchor. The pages told a story of suspicion and fear, of someone who had realized the family image was little more than a mask. She documented financial irregularities, moments where her father seemed consumed with anxiety after secret phone calls, and even her brother's reluctance to stand by her side. What struck Lane most were her final entries, which read more like confessions of fear than notes from a teenager. If anything happens to me, it won't be random. Those words made Lane certain this case was not about where Emily had gone, but about what she had uncovered. Lane then turned to Michael, the eldest son. At first, Michael's responses were stiff and mechanical, as though he was repeating something he had been told to say. He insisted Emily was troubled, that she had talked about leaving, that the family was worried but hopeful she would come back, yet his hands trembled slightly as he spoke, his voice catching whenever the subject of Emily's journal came up. Lane recognized the signs guilt buried beneath a rehearsed story, but he didn't push too hard, not yet. He wanted to let the cracks form naturally. Mr. Hartwell, on the other hand, presented himself with unnerving confidence. He looked Lane in the eye, answered each question with precision, and seemed almost offended that his word wasn't enough. According to him, Emily was simply a rebellious teenager, too curious for her own good, and she had likely left to escape the so-called pressures of family life. But Lane had heard this kind of performance before. It was the tone of someone who thought control was permanent, who believed their version of events could override the truth. Mrs. Hartwell was the hardest to read. She rarely spoke unless prompted, her answers soft and vague. When Lane asked if she had seen Emily on the night of her disappearance, she lowered her eyes and said only, "We went to bed early." It was a simple response, but her body language betrayed her. She clutched her hands tightly in her lap, her shoulders hunched as though bracing for impact. Lane knew she was hiding something, or perhaps protecting herself from something even worse. As Lane pieced together the timeline, inconsistencies piled up. Emily's phone and backpack were left behind, clear signs she hadn't planned to leave on her own. Her last online activity showed a search for how to report financial crimes anonymously, and perhaps most troubling, the financial records. Lane obtained revealed debts and transfers linked directly to Mr. Hartwell. Money was moving in and out of accounts under false names, and Emily had clearly stumbled across it. She had become a threat to her father's carefully maintained world. Think about this for a moment. If you discovered a loved one was hiding something that could ruin your family, would you expose them? Or would you stay quiet, even if it meant living with the weight of their secret? Comment your thoughts below, because Emily faced that exact choice, and her decision may have cost her everything. Lane's investigation grew heavier with each revelation. He could feel the tension building, not just in the evidence, but in the family itself. Michael's facade was starting to crack under pressure. Mrs. Hartwell was showing signs of silent suffering, and Mr. Hartwell, though composed, had begun to show flashes of irritation whenever Lane pressed too close to the truth. The detective knew he was circling something dangerous. The most haunting realization came when Lane revisited Emily's final entries again. They weren't just notes, they were warnings. She knew her family would try to dismiss her, to bury her suspicions, but she also knew they wouldn't stop there. "They don't want me to know," she had written, "but I already do." Those words replayed in Lane's mind like an echo, pushing him forward. This wasn't a missing person case anymore. This was about betrayal, manipulation, and a girl, silenced by the very people meant to protect her. The Hartwells' carefully painted image was beginning to crumble, and with it, the truth was clawing its way to the surface. The only question left was how far the family had gone to keep their secrets buried and who among them was ready to break under the weight of guilt. The Hartwell investigation reached its turning point when Michael finally broke under the pressure. He had carried his father's commands like a shield, but guilt has a way of cracking even the strongest facade. In a quiet interview room, away from his father's shadow, Michael's words began to stumble, then unravel. He admitted that Emily had confronted him on the night she vanished. She had accused their father of building their lives on lies, and warned that she planned to go to the authorities. Michael confessed that he tried to stop her, not out of hatred, but out of fear of destroying the family, fear of disappointing the man who had shaped him since childhood. His voice shook as he admitted that his father had pressured him to keep Emily under control, to remind her where her loyalties belonged. And though he never spoke the words directly, Lane knew that Michael's silence, and perhaps his actions, had played a role in sealing Emily's fate. This confession shifted the case from shadows to daylight. Lane now had the missing piece, evidence that Emily hadn't simply vanished, but had been silenced because she threatened the stability of the Hartwell empire. All paths pointed back to Mr. Hartwell, the man who had built his identity on control. He had manipulated his son, silenced his wife, and dismissed his daughter's courage as rebellion. Lane had seen men like him before, men who believed power within their own household meant immunity from consequence. But this time, he wasn't dealing with finances or lies alone. He was dealing with a family betrayal that ended in tragedy. Lane prepared his case with precision. The financial records spoke for themselves, revealing fraud and deception woven into the family's foundation. Emily's journal gave voice to her fear, her suspicions, her determination to expose the truth. And Michael's confession connected it all, pulling back the curtain on his father's manipulation. It wasn't the kind of case that promised a neat resolution. Emily's body was never recovered. No clear act of violence could be proven, but Lane had built enough to expose Mr. Hartwell for what he was. A man willing to sacrifice his own daughter to protect his empire of lies. The courtroom was filled with a heavy silence when the trial began. The community that had once looked up to the Hartwells now sat in disbelief, watching as their image of perfection collapsed. Mr. Hartwell, once so confident, now wore the expression of a man cornered. He denied everything with practiced precision. But every denial only highlighted the cracks in his story. Mrs. Hartwell sat behind him, eyes hollow, as though years of silence had drained her of all strength. Michael testified reluctantly, his words halting but clear, admitting his father's influence and his own role in keeping Emily quiet. The weight of betrayal hung in the room, pressing on every listener. When the verdict was read, the community exhaled as one. Mr. Hartwell was convicted on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. While no charge directly tied him to Emily's disappearance, the truth was clear in the eyes of those who followed the case. He had orchestrated the silence. He had built a world so fragile that the honesty of a teenage girl threatened to bring it down, and rather than face the truth, he allowed betrayal to consume his family from the inside out. The aftermath was devastating. Michael, though spared prison, lived with the crushing burden of his choices. His loyalty to his father had cost his sister her life, and no sentence could outweigh that guilt. Mrs. Hartwell, freed from her husband's control, remained imprisoned by regret. She had chosen silence over protection, and silence had stolen. Her daughter, Sarah, the youngest, grew up with only fragments of memories, carrying scars from a family legacy she could barely understand. Detective Lane closed the file knowing there was no real victory here. Justice in the courtroom could not bring Emily back, nor erase the betrayals that had destroyed an entire family. Still, the case served as a chilling reminder. Evil doesn't always arrive as a stranger in the night. Sometimes it sits at the dinner table, wrapped in familiarity, disguised as love. And when it does, the betrayal cuts deeper than any crime committed by outsiders. Think about it. What would you do if someone you trusted most was the very person tearing your life apart? Would you stay silent to preserve the illusion, or would you risk everything to speak the truth? Comment below, because stories like the Hartwells force us to face uncomfortable questions about loyalty, family, and the hidden cost of silence. Emily's story lingers because it doesn't end with resolution. It ends with loss, with questions, with warnings written in a teenage girl's journal. She was the one who dared to question, who dared to resist, and in doing so, she exposed the fault lines beneath her family's perfect mask. The Hartwell name will forever be remembered not for success or admiration, but for the betrayal that destroyed it from within. For Detective Marcus Lane, it became one of the most haunting cases of his career, not because of the evidence, not because of the verdict, but because of the truth it revealed, that the deepest crimes are not always written in blood, but in the choices families make to protect themselves at the cost of one another. And that is why Emily Hartwell's disappearance will always be remembered as the shocking truth of family betrayal. The trial of the Hartwell family drew more attention than anyone could have imagined. What had started as whispers about a missing girl became a storm of public curiosity and outrage. The courtroom was filled each day with reporters, neighbors, and strangers who had followed every twist of the case. For many, it wasn't just about what happened to Emily. It was about how a family that seemed so ordinary, so admired, could conceal secrets dark enough to destroy one of their own. Mr. Hartwell walked into court with the same composure he had shown throughout the investigation. He wore his tailored suit, stood tall, and spoke with the confidence of a man who believed his words could bend reality. But the mask he had worn for so long was beginning to slip. Detective Marcus Lane sat in the gallery, observing every reaction, every flicker of emotion across his face. Lane knew that beneath the polished exterior was a man who had controlled his family with manipulation and fear. Now, stripped of the safety of his home, he was forced to defend himself against evidence he could no longer bury. The prosecution presented Emily's journal first. The pages were read aloud, each entry pulling the jury deeper into her world. Her words were raw, filled with fear and determination. The courtroom fell silent when they heard the line, "If anything happens to me, it won't be an accident." Some jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others avoided eye contact altogether. It was no longer just evidence, it was the haunting voice of a girl who knew her end was near. Next came the financial records, transfers under false names, debts hidden behind layers of accounts, money vanishing as quickly as it appeared. It painted a clear picture of fraud and deceit, showing the empire Mr. Hartwell had built was nothing more than a house of cards. The motive became undeniable. Emily had uncovered the truth, and her knowledge threatened to bring everything crashing down. The most emotional testimony, however, came from Michael. Nervous and pale, he stepped into the witness box with the weight of the world on his shoulders. He admitted to the arguments with his sister, to the warnings from his father, to the way loyalty had twisted into silence. His words were halting, at times almost whispered, but they carried the ring of honesty. He didn't claim innocence. Instead, he confessed to weakness, to letting fear guide him when he should have protected his sister. The room was thick with tension as he described the night Emily disappeared, how she had confronted him, how he had tried to persuade her to back down. His voice broke when he admitted he would never forgive himself for not doing more. Mrs. Hartwell remained quiet throughout much of the trial. She sat behind her husband, her eyes fixed on the floor, rarely reacting to the testimony. When called to the stand, she offered vague responses, her voice flat, her face unreadable. To some, she seemed complicit. To others, she appeared broken, a woman who had spent years burying the truth under layers of silence. Lane saw it differently. He recognized the hollow look of someone who had chosen denial for too long and could no longer face reality. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom held its breath. Mr. Hartwell was found guilty on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. While there wasn't enough evidence to convict him for Emily's disappearance directly, the weight of public opinion had already judged him. He was seen not just as a criminal, but as the architect of his daughter's fate. The community was left stunned. The house that once stood as a symbol of success became a scar on the neighborhood, its shutters closed and its lawn overgrown. People who once waved to the Hartwells now crossed the street to avoid the sight. For them, it wasn't just a family's downfall, it was a reminder that appearances could be the most dangerous disguise. Detective Lane reflected on the case often. He had solved crimes before, but this one lingered because it wasn't just about law-breaking. It was about betrayal, where trust should have been strongest. Emily had been silenced, not by strangers, but by the people meant to protect her. And, though the courtroom delivered justice in part, it could never answer the most painful question: what truly happened to Emily in her final moments? The Hartwell story became a warning. It showed that evil doesn't always come from outside. Sometimes, it grows quietly inside a family, feeding on lies, silence, and fear until it consumes everything. Lane carried that lesson with him, knowing that somewhere out there, other families might be hiding secrets just as dangerous. And so, Emily's voice captured in her journal, preserved in her final words, remains the most haunting evidence of all. She tried to warn the world, and though she could not be saved, her story continues to remind us that betrayal within a family is the deepest crime of all.